I was in Dubai, standing under crystal chandeliers, a glass of champagne in my hand, when my phone buzzed. The message was short, just one line. We're terminating your position, effective immediately. After 17 years of building his empire, that was it. A text message. I scrolled down. Another line. My nephew will take over your responsibilities. I let out the faintest laugh, a sound lost in the noise of the gala. Across the room, executives from 3 continents were shaking hands, making deals worth millions. And right there, in that moment, I realized my CEO had no idea who I was sitting next to. My name is Michael Turner, 46 years old. Until that night, I was Vice President of International Development at Harrington Global, one of the most aggressive private equity firms in New York. For 2 decades, I was the man they trusted with the dirty work. I closed the deals no one else could touch, brought governments to the table, smoothed over disputes that could have sunk entire projects. I didn't get flashy bonuses or magazine covers. I got results. And now, apparently, I was expendable, replaced by a nephew, a boy who'd never stepped outside Manhattan. The message didn't make me angry. Not yet. It made me silent. Inside, something cold and methodical clicked into place, the same way it had on every high-stakes negotiation I'd ever run. You don't shout in moments like these. You observe. You calculate. You wait. My CEO, Richard Harrington, thought I was thousands of miles away, isolated, powerless. He thought he'd humiliated me. What he didn't know was that the man sitting beside me at that gala was one of the most powerful sovereign wealth fund managers in the Middle East, and he was tired of Richard's arrogance. I set the phone down, adjusted my cufflinks, and listened as my companion spoke. He wasn't aware of the message I'd just received, but I was aware of every word he was saying. Words about billions in capital, about looking for new leadership in the States, about trust that had been broken with Harrington Global. I nodded when appropriate, smiled when needed, and locked it all away in memory. Strategy starts in silence. When the dinner ended, I walked back through the marble lobby of the hotel, past men in tailored suits and women in gowns worth more than cars. The whole world thought it was business as usual. They didn't see what had just happened inside me. They didn't see how quickly the balance of power had shifted. Richard had cut me loose, but he'd done it at the exact wrong time, in the exact wrong place. And that mistake would cost him everything. Back in my suite, I opened my laptop. I didn't write an angry email. I didn't call anyone. Instead, I began a file. One word on the first page, proof. Over the years, I'd built a quiet archive. Contracts, recordings, financial discrepancies. Not to use, not out of malice, but because I knew one day loyalty would end, and I'd need leverage. That day had just arrived. I scrolled through folders, each one a potential weapon, and felt no rage. Only focus. Outside, the city pulsed with lights and noise. Inside, I was calm. Harrington thought he had ended my career with a text. What he didn't understand was that I never start fights, but I always finish them. The flight back to New York was 14 hours of silence. I didn't watch a movie. I didn't read. I sat with my notebook open, writing 3 words across the top of the page. Freeze. Track. Respond. That was my order of operations. Freeze meant no rash decisions, no emotional outbursts. Track meant documenting every move Richard made from this moment forward. Respond, well, that part would come later. When the plane landed, I turned my phone back on. Dozens of unread messages appeared, none from Richard, none from the board. Just an automated email from HR scheduling an exit interview I had no intention of attending. 17 years reduced to a calendar invite. That told me everything I needed to know about how they planned to play this. Clean cut, no loose ends, no explanations. Andrea, my ex-wife, once told me I had a talent for silence that made people nervous. She wasn't wrong. Silence isn't weakness. It's pressure. The kind that builds slowly until something cracks. Richard had just handed me the opportunity to use that silence against him. I didn't go home when I arrived. Instead, I went straight to my storage unit on the edge of Manhattan. Inside were boxes of documents, copies of contracts, financial statements, emails. Over the years, I'd kept them secure, off company property, knowing one day they might matter. That day had come. I stacked them methodically on the steel table, labeling each folder. Real estate, energy, infrastructure. Each one was a vein of gold, or a fuse waiting to be lit. By midnight, I had the outline of a map. Not of roads, but of leverage. Deals Richard had pushed through without proper disclosure. Partnerships that looked clean on the surface but were anything but underneath. I wasn't surprised. Men like Richard never cared about the details. That was my job. And because it was my job, I knew where the bodies were buried. The next morning, I walked into Harrington Global's glass tower in Midtown. No badge access anymore, but the security guard still remembered me. He asked if I was there for a meeting. I nodded once. He didn't press. Inside the lobby, I sat on a marble bench, watching the elevators open and close. Young analysts hurried in, clutching laptops and coffees, rushing to please men who would never remember their names. None of them looked at me twice. That was fine. Invisible is useful. At exactly 9:30, I stood, crossed the street to the cafe across from the building, and ordered black coffee. From there, I had a clear view of Richard's office 20 floors up. I didn't need to be inside to see what was happening. I just needed to watch, record, and wait. Harrington Global thought they'd erased me. In reality, I was closer than ever. Silence, after all, is the sharpest blade. From the cafe window, I watched Richard's nephew step out of a black car like he already owned the building. His name was Adam. I'd seen him at company parties before, a trust fund kid who thought reading one finance article made him an expert. Now he was carrying my old briefcase, the one I'd left in my office. That detail almost made me laugh. He wasn't just replacing me. He was playing dress-up in my skin. I didn't write anything down that morning. I just watched. Who went into Richard's office? Who came out? Who looked nervous? Who looked smug? 17 years inside those walls had taught me to read faces like spreadsheets. By noon, I already knew which executives were on Richard's side and which ones were just pretending. Power shifts leave shadows, and I tracked every single one. That evening, I returned to my apartment overlooking the East River. I didn't turn on the lights. I preferred the glow of the city through the windows. From my briefcase, I pulled the first folder I'd labeled the night before, infrastructure. Inside were contracts from a deal in South America, one Richard had pushed hard to close. On paper, it looked like a clean investment. But I remembered the hidden clauses, the ones that handed control to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. A shell company I later discovered was managed by one of Richard's personal attorneys. I photographed every page. Then I encrypted the files and uploaded them to a drive only I controlled. I didn't plan to leak them yet. Not to the press, not to regulators. Timing is everything. A bomb doesn't make noise when you're building it, only when it goes off. The next morning, I received an email from HR, marked urgent. It reminded me of my obligations under a confidentiality agreement I'd signed years ago. The language was sharp. No retention of documents. No disclosure of trade secrets. I read it carefully, then archived it. HR was moving quickly, which meant Richard was worried. That was good. Fear makes men sloppy. Later that week, I attended a private dinner uptown. Not a gala, not a headline event. Just a gathering of financiers and policymakers. People who mattered more than they appeared to. One of them, a senior advisor at the Treasury, leaned close and said Richard's name had been surfacing in conversations about irregularities abroad. He asked if I knew anything. I simply smiled, the same way I had in Dubai. Silence can be louder than words. Walking home that night, I understood the rhythm of the game now. Richard thought he'd replaced me with bloodline loyalty. But he hadn't replaced my memory. He hadn't replaced my proof. And he hadn't replaced the one thing that scared him most, my patience. I don't chase revenge. I let it find its own way back to the men who earn it. And Richard Harrington had just earned every ounce of it. The following week, I made my first quiet move. Not against Richard directly, not yet. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I contacted an old colleague, someone who had left Harrington Global years earlier under a cloud of suspicion. His name was Thomas Blake, a compliance officer who had raised red flags about certain accounts. Richard had buried him, forced him out with whispers of incompetence. But I remembered the truth. Thomas had been right. We met in a quiet diner on the Upper West Side, a place where no one from Midtown power circles would be caught dead. He looked older, worn down, but his eyes were still sharp. He asked why I'd reached out after all these years. I told him Richard had finally cut me loose. His reaction was a grim smile. He said he'd been waiting for that day. I didn't hand him files. Not yet. I just asked questions. About shell companies. About offshore accounts. About the deals Richard thought were invisible. Thomas didn't have everything, but he had fragments. and fragments were enough to connect with the records I already held. Before I left, he slid a small envelope across the table. Inside was a single USB drive. "Old backups," he said. I always knew this day would come. That night, I plugged the drive into my laptop. The data was messy, scattered, incomplete. But buried inside were emails between Richard and his nephew long before I was fired. They'd been planning this transition for months, positioning Adam while siphoning money through side agreements. Adam wasn't just a replacement. He was a shield, someone to take the fall if things went wrong. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. Richard hadn't simply betrayed me. He'd built an entire structure of fraud around his own blood, confident that family loyalty would keep him safe. But Richard had overlooked one critical detail. Family doesn't erase incompetence. Adam was careless, and I already saw evidence of his mistakes. The next morning, I returned to my surveillance at the cafe across from headquarters. Through the glass, I watched Adam stumble through meetings, shuffling papers, whispering frantically to assistants. Executives left his office looking irritated. A junior analyst stormed out in tears. Adam wasn't holding the line. He was breaking it. I wrote a single note in my notebook: pressure. That was the next phase. Not confrontation, not exposure. Just steady, silent pressure applied in the right places until the cracks became visible to everyone. Richard thought he'd cut me off, but all he'd really done was leave me on the outside, where I could see more clearly than ever. Revenge doesn't start with noise. It starts with patience. And I had more patience than Richard Harrington could imagine. Pressure is never about the loudest strike. It's about where you place the smallest weight until the structure buckles on its own. That week, I started placing mine. First, I sent an anonymous tip to a financial journalist I trusted. Not a story, not even evidence, just a breadcrumb. A question about whether Harrington Global's new leadership was prepared for increased scrutiny from regulators. Nothing more. But I knew the right question, in the right inbox, could grow teeth. Second, I leaked Adam's personal cell number into the hands of two brokers who thrived on chaos. They started flooding him with calls, offers, pressure pitches he didn't understand. From my vantage point across the street, I could almost see the confusion in his movements, the way he shuffled through his phone during meetings, face tightening as the noise built. Third, I made contact with a quiet ally inside the firm. Her name was Caroline, a mid-level analyst I had mentored years ago. She had ambition, discipline, and most importantly, loyalty to no one but the truth. I didn't tell her what I was doing. I didn't need to. I simply asked her to keep me informed of movements inside Richard's office. A few hours later, I received my first message. Richard had flown back from Europe unexpectedly. That meant something was breaking. I didn't celebrate. I documented. Each email, each message, each observation went into the file labeled proof. Silence was my shield, but documentation was my weapon. By Friday, the journalist had replied. Interesting. Hearing similar whispers from another source. That second source wasn't me, which meant Richard's fortress was already leaking from the inside. I just had to widen the cracks. That evening, I walked past Harrington Global one last time before the weekend. Through the glass, the office looked calm. But calm doesn't always mean stability. Sometimes it's just the stillness before the fracture. Richard had fired me with a text, thinking I'd vanish quietly. What he didn't understand was that silence, in the right hands, is an absence. It's pressure. It's presence without warning. And right now, he was feeling it without even knowing where it came from. I didn't need to rush. I didn't need to shout. Every system he'd built was already shifting under its own weight. All I had to do was wait for the sound of glass beginning to crack. And when it did, Richard would realize the mistake wasn't just firing me. The mistake was thinking silence meant surrender. The first crack appeared on Monday morning. A small finance blog published a piece speculating about Harrington Global's leadership shakeup and whether nepotism was undermining investor confidence. No evidence, no hard accusations, just shadows on the wall. But I knew how shadows worked. In a business built on perception, shadows could drain millions before a single fact was proven. By noon, the article had been picked up by larger outlets. Headlines began asking the same question. Was Harrington Global losing its edge under new leadership? I didn't have to push harder. The market was doing my work for me. Adam was suddenly a liability, and Richard knew it. Caroline messaged me that afternoon. She said Richard had locked himself in the boardroom with senior partners, voices raised. Adam pacing like a cornered animal. No one outside the glass walls could hear words, but tone carries even through silence. She described Adam's face as pale, his hands shaking when he left. He wasn't built for pressure. Richard had thrown him into the fire, and now he was burning. That evening, I opened another folder from my archive. This one contained records of a failed energy deal in Eastern Europe. On paper, it was clean, but I remembered the truth. Richard had funneled money through shell accounts, using political favors to secure permits. I photographed the documents, encrypted them, and saved them under a new label, ammunition. I wasn't ready to use them. Not yet, but I wanted them close. The next day, I received an unexpected message. Not from Caroline, not from Thomas. From an old board member, Robert Davis. He had always been cautious, slow to act, but he had never trusted Richard fully. His message was simple: we should talk. Quietly. I agreed to meet at a private club downtown. Over whiskey, he asked if I had seen the stories in the press. I said I had. He leaned closer, lowered his voice, and told me some board members were beginning to doubt Richard's leadership. They wouldn't move yet, but the idea was spreading. Then he asked the question that mattered most. Do you have anything they should see? I didn't answer directly. I didn't need to. My silence told him enough. He nodded slowly, understanding, then warned me that Richard was already searching for whoever was feeding the whispers. He suspected rivals, maybe even allies on the board. Not once did he suspect me. That was his blind spot. Walking back into the cold night, I realized Richard's empire was already tilting. The press questioned him. The board doubted him. His nephew was cracking under pressure. All without me raising my voice. This wasn't revenge yet. This was erosion. And erosion always looks slow, until the ground suddenly collapses. The collapse began with a phone call Richard didn't expect. Caroline told me it happened on a Wednesday morning, right before the weekly board briefing. A regulator had contacted the firm directly, requesting clarification on several international accounts. Nothing formal yet, just inquiries. But in our world, inquiries spread like blood in water. Investors smell it. Partners distance themselves. Confidence erodes. Richard reacted exactly as I predicted. He summoned Adam into his office, closed the blinds, and raised his voice loud enough for the assistants outside to hear. Caroline described the scene with precision. Richard accused Adam of mishandling paperwork, of attracting unnecessary scrutiny, of making him look weak. Adam didn't argue. He just absorbed the blame, face red, hands shaking. Nepotism had its limits. That night, I sat by the window of my apartment, city lights flickering below, and opened the folder labeled ammunition. I didn't release anything. I didn't need to. The regulators were already circling, and the board was restless. But I prepared the files, organizing them into a package that told a clear story. Offshore fraud, shell companies, political bribery. I saved it under one title, contingency. The following morning, Robert Davis reached out again. He said Richard looked rattled, more defensive than usual, snapping at partners, avoiding eye contact with the board. Robert didn't ask directly, but I knew what he was hoping for, proof. The kind that would tip the balance. I gave him nothing. Not yet. Timing had to be exact. Later that day, a headline appeared in a major financial paper. Whispers of trouble at Harrington Global. This wasn't a blog or a rumor mill. This was national. Stockholders would read it. Competitors would weaponize it. Richard's name was now in print alongside the word trouble. For a man obsessed with reputation, that headline cut deeper than any evidence I could provide. Caroline messaged me again that evening. She said Adam had left the office early, face pale, avoiding everyone. Richard stayed behind, pacing his office until midnight, blinds half open, a man cornered in his own tower. She added one detail that made me pause. Richard had pulled an old file from the archives. My personnel file. I leaned back in my chair when I read that. He hadn't realized until now that the silence pressing in on him could have a name. My name. He was looking for me, but he was already too late. Richard thought firing me was the end. In reality, it was the beginning. The inquiries, the headlines, the whispers, they weren't accidents. They were pressure points. And I had placed every single one of them. Soon, silence wouldn't just be my weapon. It would be Richard Harrington's prison. The week the board finally turned came faster than I expected. It began with a single investor pulling out, a pension fund in California that had backed Harrington Global for years. Their statement was polite, vague, filled with words like reallocation and portfolio adjustments. But the truth was obvious. They had read the headlines, heard the whispers, and decided the risk was no longer worth it. One exit became two, then three. By Thursday, millions in commitments had evaporated. Richard called emergency meetings, but no speech could erase what people already believed. Doubt spreads quicker than fire. Once it starts, there's no stopping it. Caroline described the atmosphere inside the office as suffocating. Assistants walked on eggshells, partners whispered in corners, and Adam avoided eye contact with everyone. Richard tried to project control, but cracks showed in every gesture. His tie loosened by noon. His temper shortened by 2. His phone rarely left his hand, as if he could text his way out of collapse the same way he had ended me. That night, I made my final preparations. The contingency file sat on my desk, encrypted and ready. Inside was everything: emails, contracts, records Thomas had given me, evidence of shell companies tied directly to Richard's personal accounts. If released, it wouldn't just embarrass him. It would end him. But I still held back. Timing was the final weapon. The next morning, Robert Davis called me directly. His voice was steady, but the weight was there. He said the board was preparing a vote of no confidence. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. Then he asked again if I had anything they should see. I let the silence stretch long enough for him to understand. Then I told him only this: when the moment comes, you'll have what you need. That afternoon, Richard made his mistake. He held a press conference, standing in front of cameras, Adam awkwardly beside him. Richard dismissed the rumors, called them fabrications, insisted Harrington Global was stronger than ever. But his voice wavered, just once, when a journalist asked about offshore accounts. That clip spread online before the press conference was even over. Investors didn't hear strength. They heard panic. I watched the broadcast from my apartment, lights off, screen glowing. For the first time in his career, Richard Harrington looked small. Not powerful, not untouchable, just a man cracking under pressure he couldn't see or control. The moment was close now. One final push, and the empire Richard had built on arrogance and nepotism would collapse entirely. And the silence he had mistaken for weakness would finally reveal itself as the weapon that destroyed him. The final push didn't come from me. It came from Richard himself. Arrogance always writes its own ending. After the disastrous press conference, he doubled down. He ordered Adam to draft statements of reassurance for investors, claiming new partnerships and growth opportunities. But Caroline sent me copies of the drafts before they went out. They were full of lies, projections that didn't exist, numbers pulled from nowhere. If those letters reached investors, it would cross the line from spin into fraud. That was the moment I decided to move. I opened the contingency file, compressed it into a single document, and sent it to Robert Davis with one sentence: for the board's eyes only. Then I closed my laptop and waited. The reaction came faster than I imagined. By that evening, Caroline texted me that the board had called an emergency session. No press, no leaks, just a closed-door meeting on the top floor. Richard didn't know yet, but the ground was gone beneath his feet. They had the proof in their hands now, and every number, every forged signature pointed directly at him. Adam's name appeared too, but only as a pawn. The shield Richard thought would protect him had become evidence of his incompetence. At midnight, Robert called me. His voice was firm this time. He said the board would vote in the morning, that Richard's position was untenable. Then he paused and added something I hadn't expected. They're asking about you. I didn't answer immediately. I watched the city outside my window, lights flickering like stars over steel. Robert explained that some board members wanted me back, not as a subordinate, not even as a vice president, but as a stabilizing force. They wanted the man who had built the company's backbone while Richard was polishing his reputation. They wanted silence, precision, discipline. They wanted me. I told Robert the first would think about it. He didn't press. He understood. The next morning, I stood outside Harrington Global's tower, not in the cafe, but on the sidewalk. For the first time since Dubai, I walked through the glass doors, past the security guard who still remembered me. Upstairs, the boardroom was closed, voices muted behind polished wood. I didn't need to be inside to know what was happening. Votes were being cast. An empire was ending. Richard had fired me with a text, believing it erased me. But now, as the board stripped him of power, I realized the truth. Silence hadn't erased me. Silence had made me inevitable. The vote came down before noon. Caroline messaged me just 2 words. It's over. Richard Harrington was removed as CEO, effective immediately. The official statement spoke of retirement and family priorities, but everyone inside those walls knew the truth. He hadn't stepped down. He'd been stripped. I stayed on the sidewalk, watching as black cars pulled up, board members leaving one by one. Their faces were unreadable, but their silence said everything. Richard's reign had ended not with a scandal splashed across headlines, not with a courtroom battle, but with a quiet execution carried out by the very men he thought would protect him. Later that evening, Robert called again. He told me the board wanted me back, not to rebuild Richard's empire, but to steady the wreckage. He said the investors trusted me. He said my silence carried more weight than Richard's speeches ever had. Then he asked if I was ready to return. I thought about it long after we ended the call. I thought about the years I had given to Harrington Global, the loyalty I had offered, the arrogance that had discarded me in a single text message. I thought about Adam, left to bear the shame of a family name. And I thought about Richard, sitting alone somewhere, realizing that the man he'd erased had been the one pulling the strings all along. The next morning, I gave my answer. Not in person, not on the phone. I sent a single email to the board. I don't rebuild broken empires. I build my own. That was all. No negotiation. No explanation. Silence. Once again, doing what words never could. Weeks later, the papers reported on Harrington Global's restructuring. Richard vanished from the public eye. Adam returned quietly to obscurity. The firm survived, scarred but intact. And my name never appeared in a single story. That was how I wanted it. I moved on. Different city. Different skyline. Different projects. My file labeled proof stayed locked away, untouched but never destroyed. A reminder of what silence can do when patience guides it. Richard fired me with a text message in Dubai, believing that would be my ending. What he never understood was that silence was never surrender. Silence was strategy. And when the time came, it was silence that finished him. Some men fight back loud. Some burn everything in their path. I never had to raise my voice. I just waited, planned, and listened until the moment arrived. In the end, Richard Harrington lost everything. And I walked away without saying a word. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.